For decades, Kevin Killiany was an actor, drill rig operator, warehouse grunt, photographer, and paperboy, but in 1980s found himself drawn into teaching and working with young people. He taught high school, elementary school, and community college before moving into community mental health, where he worked crisis intervention, community support, and family preservative services. Gavin sold his first short stories in 2000 and since then has written for Star Trek, Doctor Who, and several role-playing games. In 2011, he became a full-time writer and editor, but gradually came to realize that sitting alone in a room arguing with his computer was neither an exciting nor as glamorous as he had imagined. In 2015, Kelvin returned to the college classroom part-time as an adjunct English instructor and has found his dream career in a healthy balance of both writing and teaching people who want to write. Kelvin lives with his wife, Valerie, in Wilmington on the coast of North Carolina. And on today's episode of Auto Interview, it's a pleasure to have Kevin Killiany on the show. Welcome on the show, Kelvin.
Well, I'm very glad to be here. And I think I'm going to mention something that Kelvin with an L in it is a very popular name in the South. And I know you've worked with other writers named Kelvin, an excellent writer Kelvin Conyers. I got his book. Excellent,
Yeah.
excellent work. But my name does not have an L in it. It is Kevin. And in the South, I am called Kelvin all the time. I hear it all the time. If you call me Kelvin, that's fine. I still answer. But it is a pleasure to talk to you. I've been watching your videos, your interviews, and I'm very pleased to be part of this.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, and thank you for the correction.
So I do it all the time.
Now, Kevin, please tell us about your book, Down to Dirt. How does this book come about? What inspired you to write the book?
Well, I hope you have time for a long story. Uh, I had I grew up in Central Florida at the time of the space program in the 50s and the 60s.
Mm.
Um, and it's at that time, my father was an engineer. He worked for a company that worked for a company that worked for the space program at Cape Canaveral.
Oh,
So when I was a little kid, I thought my dad was an astronaut, but he wasn't. He worked in a he worked in a lab designing things. But I love space. I love science fiction. I became a big fan of the books from the early part of the 20th century, the science fiction books, and I loved them a lot. And when I got older, and my son was old enough that I thought he'd enjoy reading them, I started reading some of the old classics to see what I could share with him.
mm.
And I discovered something that I did not notice
Oh,
as a child or as a white child growing up in the 60s in America.
oh,
American science fiction writers thought that only white American men would get into space. They didn't have anyone of color. They didn't have any women unless they were a beautiful assistant or the daughter of a scientist or something like that. And the thing about people of color particularly struck me because in 1980 this was very unusual in the US. Now it's quite common, I'm happy to say. But this is a picture of me with my wife.
oh,
Okay. And yeah, that my wife Valerie. And we married in 1980.
oh,
And I entered into a world I never imagined. As a white person growing up in the South in America, it was a time of a lot of separation. It was much better than it had been in the 50s and 60s, but it was still a difficult time. And we've made a lot of progress since then. We've lost a little bit of ground recently in the last few years, but I a thing I always say is fish don't see water. White people who don't see or interact with other people very much
Mm.
don't realize how segregated, how much prejudice is built into our culture. Because we don't see it. It doesn't affect us directly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, it was. I'm still learning things. I am after 42 years of marriage. I am still. Oh golly, we're coming up on 43 in a couple of months. Okay, I I need to remember that. Send me a reminder. I need to get a gift. Anyway, um, so it particularly struck me that I had nothing to share with my son that would give him the same excitement I had had because
Oh.
he wasn't in the book. He wasn't there.
Mm.
And and I have to say that it was not because science fiction writers deliberately left out people of color, indigenous people. They just weren't in the books, not deliberately, but because it never occurred to them to include them, which is actually worse
Mm.
than doing it deliberately. I mean, it's like a blind spot that is obvious to everyone except us. We don't see it.
Yeah.
Um, so I set out, and unfortunately, I never got the books written while my son was my age, but my son was a child.
Oh.
Um, he's 36 now, which is hard to believe. But I don't know why my kids grew up. I haven't changed a bit, honestly. Um, okay, I might be exaggerating, but so I set out. I wondered what would happen if the world was just like it was in the science fiction books, with only the white people in space. And now, back in the 60s, we thought we would be living on satellites by the year 2000, that we'd have colonies on the moon. I mean, in
Mm.
1950s and 1960s, we were, um, and well, basically because I lived in a community that was involved with people who were working, building things for the space program, everyone
Yeah.
was sure that this was the future, that we were all getting off the planet. This is great. At that didn't happen, which is sad for me. I was really planning on living at the moon by this time, but
Oh.
it's not going to happen. I
Wow.
want to live on the moon, but anyway, so it took me a long time. I went and I said, okay, how could the world get with the white people in space and then the civil rights movement of the 60s, which was totally, I don't know if everyone who's not an American appreciates the fact that there was a tremendous cultural upheaval in the United States in the 60s.
Oh.
So, what if the 60s hit after the white elitists and everything were mostly in space and all of that? And how would the world be different? And I'm a teacher, all right? I couldn't just write the story. I had to make the whole world so that the story would make sense. So I spent a lot of time. What would I change in history? How could I make that work? Um, the whole time I was working on this, I was imagining a great epic story with hundreds of people in different places, all doing things to bring about change, and it didn't work. I mean,
Wow.
I built this world for over a decade. I was working on this. My son graduated from college. I'm still working on this. Uh,
Wow. That's a
anyway,
lot.
well, if I was the kind of writer who could just tell a story and not have it all make sense, not have the world all worked out, I would have written it a lot sooner. But I am the kind of a meticulous sort of person when it comes
Oh.
to building worlds and cultures. Um, and that ties in with another job I had, I'll tell you about later. But I couldn't make it work. I tried to make it work. I couldn't make it, just wasn't working. I mean, I had thumb drives full of really bad manuscripts of me trying to make
Oh.
this work. And one day, the way I remember it, there was this teenager in my head complaining about the fact that her parents were sending her down to dirt. Now, I know there was not a teenager in my head. I'm the only person in my head. Okay, I know this.
Yeah.
But but what was happening was the artist part of me, the more intelligent part of me, had realized a story like I was writing wasn't going to affect anyone.
Oh,
I needed to write a story about young people in the midst of all this change, dealing with all the change around them.
oh,
And and as a teacher, I always worked with young people, working in community resources, working with kids who were in the foster program or kids who were fallen between the cracks, and trying to help them adjust to life. Um, I understood that these were people that actually would read and benefit
oh, that's
from
great.
this sort of story. And
Oh,
once I had that, I the story kind of fell into place. I realized I had three people representative of the different situations. I had the young elitist girl from who lived in space on
mm,
Tombaugh space station, and her parents. She was training to go on the first mission to Jupiter. She's 16, and as she completed her education the way they had it mapped out for her, because in the Space Corps, everything is they're very limited people, so everybody has a role to play. They're
mm,
constantly tested to find out what their aptitude is and what they'd be good at and what they do. And she was going to go on the mission to Jupiter, which was going to take the rest of her life. She would be leaving Earth orbit around when she was about 20 and would never come home because this wasn't Star Trek or Magic. The ships don't go zipping back and forth. It takes years to get from place to place
absolutely. That's
between
great.
planets. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to keep it real. It's what they call hard science fiction, where you use
Oh,
real science. It doesn't mean it's difficult science fiction. It means to use proven things. You use actual science to make everything work. You don't magically invent unobtainium or some other material that will transport you through time and space.
mm,
Yeah, so there's no going to be a
great.
warp drive or a TARDIS or anything. It's going to be a rocket taking a long time to get where it's going.
Absolutely. I love the sound of that. It really sounds very interesting to me. And now this will
And
make me to ask you, Kelvin, as authors, we'll all have different ways of reacting to feedbacks and criticism. And I'm curious to know your opinion about criticism. How do you react to negative criticism of your books in time past if you've ever had one?
oh my, um, well, I think I have an editor who named Philip Lee, and he's a very brave man because I my first reaction to criticism usually involves a flamethrower. I get
Wow.
I get very my first response is like, "How dare you!" I'm like, my what I have to do, and I have to really. I've gotten better. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm older now. I don't have all the energy, but
Yeah.
I have to separate when you write a story. It's a thing that you have done, and if somebody is criticizing your story, they're not criticizing you. So you can't take it personally. They're giving their honest reaction to something
Absolutely.
you've shown them.
Yeah.
Now, I know that, but it takes me a few minutes to feel that when it happens.
Mm.
Okay. Because my first reaction is, right, I know I seem very pleasant, but I have a furious temper. And so, and it usually takes me a minute to calm down. And once I
Oh,
calm down and pay attention, I often find that this input is very, very good. It's something I can learn from. I may not agree with them, but I'll look and I'll say, okay, they thought that because I didn't do this
mm,
so that they could understand what I meant. They missed my whole message because I didn't give them my message right. It's
mm,
not that they were too foolish to see the message, it's that I didn't communicate well. Um, Now, the hardest thing to do for me is not go back and rewrite something because this is important. If you and I'll say this and I say this a lot when I was teaching writing too. Once you have written a story, you have written that story. Going back now, obviously, you're going to go through and tighten things up and explain things a little bit. You got to revise what you've written, but
Yeah,
at a certain point, you have to say this is it, and you send it out.
yeah,
Once you have sent it out, you can't go back and rewrite it. Now, a terrible thing I used to do that would waste my time is if I sent a story off to be published, and I sent off stories. I My first sale was in 2000. The first time I sent off a story, I was 16 years old. It was 1967, and
oh,
I sent off a story. I still have it. It's terrible. It is
oh,
terrible. I was 16 years old. I didn't know what I was doing. But anyway,
wow.
um, when I got that rejection the first time, I took that story and I rewrote it from word one and I sent it off to somebody else and they rejected it and I rewrote it. I have all those copies because that's back in the days of paper, and I've got boxes and boxes of paper with all my old stories in them because I thought I could do something great with them someday. And it's very, very humbling to go through these old stories and
Mm.
discover how bad I was and how I had to grow. And I realized I was wasting a lot of time rewriting things that weren't good to begin with. And what I needed to do was take what I had learned and apply it to my next story.
Oh, that's
You
great.
may have a you may have a story you love, it doesn't sell, send it off a few times, don't rewrite it, just send it to different publishers.
Yeah,
If it doesn't sell, put it in a box, take what you've learned, anything that the editor said about why they didn't want the story, why it didn't work, once you finish screaming about it, of course. But once you take all that information and add it to the next thing you do
that's
until you
great.
perfect your craft, because this is a craft. And
Yeah.
if you know a musician or something, you know that they practice for hundreds of hours. For every hour they play on stage, they practice for hundreds of hours. And I think writers a lot of time believe that if they've written something, this needs to sell. They're going to send it off to see if it sells. And if it doesn't sell, they're going to keep. No, that was your practice. Okay.
Yeah.
That was running scales. That was whatever. I don't play an instrument. I don't know what they do when they practice. So, but it was not, that was practice. Put it away. That was learning. Build on that.
That's great. I so much admire your response to these questions. They're quite amazing. And I just want to give a notice that we have 15 more minutes left for the conversation.
Ah,
5, 10, 15, and we have about more 4, 5 questions to go. So I don't know how we can tackle it.
uh,
So
well, you're talking to a retired teacher. I'm used to, I can speak for hours to a room full of high school students who don't want to be there. Okay. So I will do my best,
well,
but it
that's
will be
funny.
difficult for me.
Yeah, so actually, I think now we should have like 14 more minutes left to go. Hopefully, if we can give like maybe 3 minutes to the answers, maybe that'll be fine.
I'll
I
try.
have to move to my next question now.
All right.
So, Calvin, you also have a book titled Rise from Dirt. Can you tell us a bit about the making of it too?
Yes, I can. Can I do it in 3 minutes? I'll try. Okay. Um, okay. The books in the series,
Yeah.
well, this was my first one, Down to Dirt.
Mm,
Okay. And
yeah.
that's about her parents sending her down to dirt so she could see what Earth was like before she went to Jupiter.
Yeah.
The second one was Life on Dirt, and that is while she's living on Earth and what she discovers and what happens there. And I bring in some additional characters then too, because we start to see more of Earth and more of the space station.
Mm,
And that, by the way, is that's Fatima. She's a friend of hers from space, and that's Mara. She's the girl in the story.
yeah.
The last one, Rise from Dirt. Mara, while she's on Earth, she's staying with her cousin Beth, and her cousin Beth's best friend is Jael, who is a young woman of color. and she wants to get into space. So she's
Mm.
trying to break the color barrier to get into space. So Rise from Dirt is Jael's story as she is fighting the system trying to get into space. And it is
Oh,
about her challenging every step of the way. And of course, the whole system is against her. And it's
oh,
actually the longest book because she has a very long fight getting to
oh,
where she's
wow.
going. Okay.
That's great.
So Rise from Dirt is the story of Jael, who is fighting to become the first person of color, first woman in space. And it's well, as you can see, it's a lot more. She's got a crash spaceship next to her, so you know it gets a little rough in this book. But
Yeah, I love the
anyway,
cover design.
yeah, and it's yeah, these are very nice covers. I like these. This is the second edition. The
Oh,
artist for the first edition had very sort of not exciting covers, and the new covers are great. So I'm very happy with those. They tell more of the story and give a better idea of what's going on.
oh, that's great.
So each of these stories, one is about both. All of them are about rebellion. All of them are about adjusting. All of them are about finding your way in a hostile world, and they're all written from the perspective of young people. And as someone once pointed out, they are actually a primer on systemic racism for young white people who never thought of it. so,
Oh,
that wasn't my intent, but that's kind of what happens.
oh, that's great to know. I
Yeah,
love the sound of the book. Thank you so much for sharing it. And now,
certainly.
Kelvin, I'm curious to know if you experienced any challenges while writing your book. If there is any, could you share with us what challenge it is and how you ultimately overcame it?
My hard part was shutting up.
Oh,
I oh, these are stories told by young people, and in every case, actually, most of them young women. Um, and as someone who has spent my adult career working with young people, I had to learn that in actually working with them, you have to listen when they're talking
absolutely.
and not just wait for your turn to tell them what's right, okay, which is what adults usually do.
Yeah.
And so my hardest part for me was getting out of my way because I would try, hang on, I forgot to put my phone on silent. It's a ringing over here. I don't know if you can hear it.
I can
Um,
hear.
well, it's off now. Anyway, um, so the most difficult part for me was getting out of the way and letting my characters do the storytelling and
Mm.
not drop in a sermon or a bunch of information or all of that. So the hardest part for me in writing was getting out of my way. Now I had an advantage because I was teaching at a community college and
Oh,
I had beta readers. I had people who wanted to read my books who would read and tell me what I was doing right and what I was doing wrong.
wrong. That's
And that didn't affect their grade one way or the other. Okay. I did not flunk them for not liking my work, but but I, accepting that feedback and knowing I had the problem and
mm.
accepting the feedback about it, those were my biggest challenges.
That's great. So, Kelvin, I'd love to ask you, what is publishing like for a published author like yourself? What are the challenges you've encountered in terms of marketing your books? What are the mediums you've utilized so far in promoting your books?
Well, my experience is not typical because I'm older and publishing now is nothing like it was when I was coming up. Okay,
Mhm.
because we didn't have all of the options for self-publishing and everything.
Yeah.
Um, and most of my writing, as you mentioned, I wrote for Star Trek, for Doctor Who. I've written for role-playing games. Um, and if you're not in the industry, you don't know that there's a lot of writing that goes on. When I say I wrote for Star Trek, it's not an episode, it was short stories and novellas related to Star Trek.
Mm.
Um, for role playing games, I have written worlds that role players play in, I've created those. All of those were intellectual properties that belonged to other people. So,
Oh,
as a writer, media tie in is right for hire. As a writer, I had nothing to do with the publishing aspect of it. I just did that. When I came to writing my original fiction, I had a lot of ideas from the 50s and 60s and well, not 50s. I wasn't thinking about writing then, but you know, the 20th century ideas that
mm.
don't apply anymore. And
Oh,
I went with a hybrid publisher, which they handle a lot of the mechanics of printing and all of that, marketing. It's not the same as a vanity press. Stay away from some. There are some that just feed on writers. Don't pay attention to those. I want to, in the future, moving forward, I will be
mm,
taking more full control and doing the self-publishing route. But I am taking courses. I'm learning how the industry works. And uh, now, before I take that step, I need, I'm meticulous, I'm a teacher, I want to know everything before I get in instead
that's
of
great.
jumping in and figuring it out. That's a lot of people do that. I am constitutionally incapable of doing that. I need to know where I'm going before I start out.
Absolutely. It's very important,
Yeah, for me, it's vital. Yes.
Yeah, that's great. So I also want to ask you, Kelvin, as a published author, what sort of advice do you have for other writers who are still struggling with publishing a book like yours? What would you tell people in this category?
Well, for publishing, I think I've answered that. I'm still studying what to do. So I don't, I would recommend doing extensive research,
Research.
not what worked felt well for this person.
Mm,
Look at the options. There are many websites that describe routes you can follow. There are a lot of places you need to be aware of, but there are
absolutely.
also sites that tell you which ones to worry about.
Absolutely.
So, so do all of your research first. More importantly, like I said, 1967 to 2000. I was an overnight success in 33 years. Okay, it took me
Oh,
30 took me 33 years. I'm not saying everyone take 33 years, but I'm saying don't get discouraged. You're gonna Sometimes you're gonna stop. Sometimes you're gonna need a break. You may go months without writing a word,
mm,
and then you need that. You need to develop. You need to grow. Don't think I'm not a
absolutely.
writer because I'm not writing every day. Yeah, you're still a writer. You're a writer taking a breather, taking a break, but you're still a writer.
That's great.
And just keep going. And that's all don't let a pause stop you. Just take it as a rest and keep moving forward. That's the only way to get where you're going.
Oh, thank you so much. I love your advice, and I'm hopeful that viewers, including myself, would love to utilize it. So, Kelvy, please tell us where can we get a copy of your book in case we have viewers who love to be
Well,
get a copy?
yeah, you can, of course, on Amazon. My books are available there. I would actually direct you to the Evolved Publishing website. Now, I sent you links. I
Yeah,
don't know if you're going to be able to post those in
I
in
receive
the,
it. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. The the first book is on sale, so you can get that one hard. This is a trade paperback, large paperback format.
Wow.
You can get this for about $7 now because it's on sale. The others are full price, so they're about $20. I'm sorry about that. Um, I don't set the price. That's what my publisher does.
Oh,
And of course, the ebooks are available. I would recommend the prices. I think are check the prices. I think right now they're better on Evolved than they are on Amazon. Either one of those sites. Other places, we also market through a company called Draft Digital, and they go to all several outlets. I don't know all the outlets that those books go to
yeah.
um, with their marketing, but yeah, my recommendation: go to the publisher because that reflects well on me. The publisher says, "Hey, this is selling, so maybe we should give him another contract." Anyway, or whichever is most convenient for you, of course.
Yeah, and I've left a link in the description part of this interview for viewers who would love to get a copy directly. So thank you so much, Calvi, for accepting the invitation to be featured on English Literature. It's a pleasure having you on the show.
Well, it has been a pleasure to be here, Peter. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.